Everyone, welcome back. And today we are going to talk about 6 things to know about Anne of Green Gables. Last time we had our summary. There is the author and a number of some of the adaptations of the book. And there is a book cover. So we are going to discuss a little bit here of the background. There's one allusion in the book that I want to focus on, but a little bit of the background and the history of the book, particularly taking place in Canada and during the first wave of feminism when women were just starting to protest and try to get the vote, and suffrage was sort of beginning, or at least beginning to be noticed. I'll put it that way. So let's get started. The author, Lucy Maud Montgomery, there she is as a younger girl. She was born in 1874 and lived on Prince Edward Island in Canada, where she set most of her books. The place where she grew up was the inspiration for Green Gables. I showed you guys a picture of that last time. It's since become a national park in Canada. Now, her mother died when she was 2 years old from typhoid. Her father basically, and this would not have been that unusual at the time, the man would not have been thought capable often of taking care of a child, especially a girl. So he sent her to be with relatives, and that's where the Green Gables farm was located. And then he eventually remarried. So a little bit of a difficulty growing up. But she wrote over 20 novels, 500 short stories, and 500 poems. Published in 1908, Anne of Green Gables had 6 printings in its first year. I cannot stress enough how unusual that would have been. Having a print run by a publisher means that they bought so many books, and that would have been a typical first run. So to have that 6 times just in the first year would have been unusual. It was also translated to Swedish and French and other languages, also in its first or second year. That's somewhat typical for bestsellers today because we have things like foreign language rights, but for back then it would have been quite unprecedented. So this was followed by 5 more books featuring just Anne, and then there were 2 more that featured her children, which in total were published from 1909 until 1939. So quite a long span there. And we really see Anne, from age 11 to almost age 50. So when it ends, one of the books is set in the time of World War I. So you can kind of imagine, the time span there. She quickly became, because of this, a beloved Canadian author, receiving an Order of the British Empire, OBE, award for her contributions to the arts. There were other awards that she won as well that were also quite important. I believe she was the first woman allowed into, I'm going to forget the name of this because I didn't put it in here, but I think it's basically like the Canadian Arts and Letters Society, something like that. She was the first woman who was permitted entry into that elite organization. However, it has been said that for a woman who had given the world so much joy, life was mostly an unhappy one. So there she is again. In her later life, she was first engaged to a man named Edwin, who she became to despise. She thought he was quite vain and pretentious, and she realized that she didn't love him. Then she fell in love with a man named Norman. And her family and her friends did not approve of him. They pressured her to break it off. She wrote about being a Christian woman, and especially at that time, she would not have engaged in certain activities, but they had what she felt was a passionate love affair where they kissed. And this is a time, remember, when people sometimes would kiss just after they were engaged or possibly at the altar. So for some of them, anyway. So they shared a few passionate moments. She was pressured to cut things off. She did, but she was going to go back to him, and then he died of Spanish influenza during that outbreak. So later, then, feeling she had few prospects and still sort of mourning that loss, she married a minister, and he suffered from severe depression called religious melancholia. He really felt he might still be going to hell, even though he was a Christian. He would just sort of stare into space considering some of these things, and it was very difficult for her. She suffered from bouts of depression herself, and her husband refused to help with their children or the housework. He thought that women were sort of inferior to men. I don't know how he contended with the fact that she made quite a bit of money from her books, and I even kind of wonder if refusing to help with the housework, it was kind of like his way of saying, this is your real work, not the stories that you write. He was not a person who enjoyed reading. She wrote about that in many letters to friends and family members, which have been studied. So we know quite a bit about her life and her marriage, at least from her perspective. So she found a solace in writing, and really that was kind of an escape from the problems of her domestic life. The first book was written, I think, just before her marriage, and you can see how it's kind of an idealized version of her younger life, and then how she might have hoped that it would have turned out. Montgomery really, though, is the most successful Canadian author of all time in terms of sales. However, here we go. Mark Twain described the character of Anne as the dearest, most lovable child in fiction since the immortal Alice. So her work was quite admired. And Mark Twain, of course, wrote Tom Sawyer, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But she's often dismissed as being not a serious writer. Women and children were her primary audience, and oftentimes books for women and books for kids are dismissed by academics. So that's not an important book, or that's not, especially, I mentioned this before, it's quite a happy, joyful book where the author has an amused, the narrator has an amused tone, and yeah, so people didn't study it for quite a long time. Kind of dismissed it. Our setting. This is the Prime Minister of Canada. At the time, he is mentioned in the book. So she was born in 1874. The book is set in 1876. It takes place on Prince Edward Island. Of the author's childhood, there are some anachronisms, but you can kind of see that she is nostalgic for the past. I'll put it that way. The anachronisms are little things that don't fit and are more. So there's a few things like Anne wants to wear a dress with puff sleeves. Puff sleeves were much more in fashion at the time the author wrote this in 1908. So it's just a few little things like that. I honestly, as contemporary readers, we probably wouldn't even pick up on them. So later on in one of the books, Anne has a telephone, which would not have been available in a rural area at that time. So just little things like that. I forgot I was going to put the telephone thing right here. It's not in this book, but it's in one of the later ones. At any rate, in 1840, Upper and Lower Canada were united into one province of Canada, and it was still considered part of the British Empire. The country, Canada, was fully formed in 1867, but it wasn't until 1982 that Canada became a completely self-governing nation. So at the time the book is set, Canada has really only been a country for 11 years. And still, it is part of the British Empire, and really that only changed in our recent history. So the book is depicting a very new country, and it is concerned with Canadian identity, particularly this region of Canada on Prince Edward Island. It's a small, tight-knit rural community. It isn't so much that they talk too often about being Canadian. I don't mean that, but what I mean is that the author is trying to depict everyday Canadian life in a realistic way, to show what that world looks like. So as you read, kind of consider, what does it mean to be Canadian, especially in this rural community? What do these people value? They do talk about their politics briefly, because briefly, it's not a political book, but they talk about politics briefly. They go to a few political meetings. They go to a few religious meetings that are sort of part of that. Canadian values. I will say this too before I read this quote from Justin Trudeau. This is the church that was just around the corner from the Green Gables house. I actually was able to go and attend a service there when I visited. So it's still a church today. This is a picture from around that time. And it looks pretty much exactly the same. They've changed the window in the front, but other than that, it's about the same. But the book was sort of caused people in the United States who read it to think that that was what Canadian life was like in 1908. And this is set before 1908, obviously, in the 1870s and 80s. So, 25 years before it was written. And also, the book is in a rural community. So some people in the US kind of judged it and said, oh, that's how all Canadians are. They're all simple and farmers and fishermen and that kind of thing. And that really wasn't the case. But I do think it was the case at a certain point of time in that region. But at any rate, in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said, quote, "There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada. However, there are shared values. Openness, respect, compassion, willingness to work hard, to be there for each other, to search for equality and justice." I'm sharing that quote with you because I feel like those are some of the values that we see in this book. So what he's trying to say is, look, Canada is made up of a lot of different people, and it is diverse, just like the United States. But we still have these shared values, these core values of being compassionate, wanting to work hard, trying to be there for each other. And look for those in this book. One scholar, Seymour Lipset, studied the differences between Canada and the United States. He had a longitudinal study, that means a long-term study, from 1940 to 1968, and he found that the two countries were extremely similar, except that the U.S. had a tendency towards certain political values, which included individualism and competitiveness, entrepreneurship and high risk-taking, anti-establishment tendencies, and inclination to political crusades. We're going to hit that last one in a moment. In contrast, Canada tended to score lower in these areas. So they looked at things more like, instead of individualism, community, tradition as opposed to being high risk taking, holding up the establishment a little bit more. All of those things sort of coincided with the Canadian values that Justin Trudeau is explaining. So the book doesn't make direct comments on these matters, or at least not many, but you can see hard work, compassion, openness. There is a desire to preserve a certain way of life and keep the establishment. There's not any questioning of the church, of school, of the kind of social order. Nobody is trying to break that down. But they still want a little bit of progress. So, for example, Anne says something like, "I don't understand why there couldn't be a woman minister. I would think that women would make wonderful ministers." Mrs. Rachel Lynde says that women should have the vote, right? So there is a little bit of progress, but they're not aiming for that progress in like a hard-hitting way. I guess I'll put it that way. Here are some pictures. I want you guys to get the feel. I'm going to zoom in on these. I want you guys to get the feel for what life would have looked like. This is McPherson Brothers Tailoring and Clothing, a store in one of the towns of Prince Edward Island. It's a very small island, even in and of itself, and it is quite isolated. This is, I'll just put them up and then I'll go into each one. I love this. Two young ladies at Prince Edward Island about this time, coming home from school or going to school in the rain. The candid shot for back then. We didn't have too many candid pictures, so I just think that this is great. And you can kind of picture Anne and Diana or one of her other friends, the hats, the little capelets, ready to go to school. This is a school at the college, Queen's College, which is featured in the book. Quite a small class, right? Quite a small school. And this is their graduation picture. So the guys are in suits. The girls are all in similar white dresses. And they look very excited. Just kidding. You'd have to stand for quite a long time in photographs still back then. But yes, they are all going to be teachers. And then this is kind of interesting. This man has 14 children, and this is 5 generations of pullers altogether. From a newspaper, you can see them pulling in the boat. Fishing life isn't featured really as much in this book, but really it's more focused on the farms, but that is a big part of life on the island. And this is the island today. I want to be proud of myself for taking such a nice shot. Yeah, so you can see all the fishermen there, and then over here is a place where you can eat the lobster that they're catching. 4 generations on a farm. So I picked this picture and the other one because you can kind of see these traditions, right? Of 5 generations of pullers, 4 generations on a farm in Prince Edward Island. This life there, this very traditional agrarian society. I did not take this one. I wish I had, but it's gorgeous. But you can see here all of the flowers and the seaside, the red sands that are quite prominent on the island. And this is, oops, sorry guys. This is why the book I think is so beautiful, because Anne has such an imagination and she certainly has a great landscape for it. So these are some of the things you can kind of picture while she's talking about things like the violet veil and all of that. Oh, and that's Queen's College. A picture of it further in. So yeah, so that's the landscape of the novel and a little bit of the history. So let's talk about the role of women. These are some suffragettes, some Canadian suffragettes having a march for the right to vote. And I love this. They're law-abiding, just in case you were wondering. I'm not sure what they did to this little kid here, but they're law-abiding on their bikes, and there's some men with them. It's not just women, right? At this time, women did not have the right to vote in national elections. Widows and spinsters who owned property were allowed to vote in local elections. The Canadian voting history, it took quite a bit of time for different groups to be allowed to vote. So this is the first wave of feminism, right when we are looking toward people gaining the right to vote. But in the book, and really in Canada at the time, and I honestly think that this is a reflection directly of the author herself, there was a slight ambivalence on the issue of women's rights. So, for example, Mrs. Rachel Lynde does want the vote, but she doesn't approve of women's ministers, and she doesn't really approve of women going to college along with the boys. That's a lot of learning that they don't necessarily need. So she's not a spinster, and she's not a widow, and she would not really own the property she lives on, right? That would belong to her husband. So she, as a married woman, is not allowed to vote. So you can see how she, especially someone of such strong opinions, would want that right. And yet it's interesting that the right to vote doesn't really extend to other types of equality. Avonlea society is quite matriarchal as well. So Anne's not the only strong woman readers encounter. And when we get into the themes next time, I'm going to kind of go through some of those women. But just for right now, Marilla, who takes Anne in. Rachel, who we've mentioned a couple times. There's Miss Stacy, who is the second teacher that Anne has at Avonlea School. Josephine Barry, who is the aunt of one of her friends. There are a number of very strong, very opinionated women in this book, and it's not just that they're opinionated, it's also that they work hard, that they have certain ambitions in life sometimes, and they are really role models for her. So in this matriarchal society, I want to zoom in on this. I want to say, too, it could be partially matriarchal because this is a book written for girls, and so there are not as many men featured. But the idea of women being non-aggressive, dependent, submissive, passive, home-oriented, talkative, gentle, sensitive, crying, emotional, verbal, kind, a lot of these characteristics we see in Anne. And I think that many women's books where feminism is a prominent theme, the women tend to be not having some of these traditional, or what are thought of as traditional feminine traits. But Anne is easily hurt emotionally. She is very talkative. She is very sensitive to other people's feelings, and emotional and verbal and kind. On the other hand, she's also not that easily influenced. When she makes up her mind to do something, she does it. And in that way is quite independent. Very active. This is not a passive character. Let's see. There was something else here. Well, nurturing, yes. There was another one possibly on a different list that was like stubborn and ambitious. Those are often thought of as masculine traits as well. So Anne definitely is a girl and loves doing kind of girly girl things like putting flowers in her hat and wandering through the woods thinking of how she might have a proposal someday, and writing a story of a girl who is proposed to and her acceptance takes up a whole page, right? But she is also independent and not easily influenced and active in the world. So look for that kind of blending, because we see a lot of that in many of the female characters. They're a lot also quite more boisterous than the male characters, which we see particularly in Matthew, who is so shy. He can barely even talk to Anne the first time he meets her, and he's more influenced. Marilla is a little bit more dominant than he is, but then when he wants something, he can be stubborn in his own way. So yeah, compare Matthew with Marilla and Rachel. Matthew does have strength and conviction. It's just not quite as obvious. When he does decide to, as he puts it, put his oar in to help raise Anne, it's at a few critical points where he knows that, or he doesn't feel that Marilla is going to make the right decision. The schoolmaster, Mr. Phillips, with the second teacher, Miss Stacy, that is a huge difference. So look for those changes as well. In this society, it's not that Anne will necessarily have the same choice of career options that some of the boys will have. And I have to say, too, especially in an agrarian, rural society like this, a lot of the boys are looking to be fishermen and farmers, to help out on the family farm the way that we saw the pictures, in the pictures that I just showed you. So it's not as if, they're not really that wealthy either for the most part. So it's not as if they have any option open to them either. So it's just something to take in consideration. But at any rate, it doesn't mean that she's going to have a large choice of careers. But what it does mean is that there are many choices in the type of women and the type of woman that she could become. And she doesn't have to be, as some of her friends are, a little bit more submissive. She also doesn't have to be aggressive and tough. And so it's this interesting balance between these things. Now, I will say some of her more masculine traits, being independent, and active, sometimes those are admired and sometimes they're not. The emotional way that she reacts to people, her temper, those are things that are thought more of as some of her faults. So look for how that's depicted, because I think that the author struggled with that herself, as many of us do today. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a girl? What kind of person do I want to become? Realism. Okay, so this is a picture, an illustration from Tom Sawyer, or possibly Huck Finn. I believe it's Tom Sawyer, from Mark Twain. Previously, with some of our other books, we discussed romanticism. And romanticism in books, this novel mentions being romantic quite a bit, and it's referring to literary romanticism for the most part. Strong emotions, faraway settings, an obsession a little bit with the antique or things of history, so things like King Arthur, which we'll talk about in a minute. Having stories set like in India, for example, which would have been like a strange foreign place that they didn't know much about, things of that nature. And so Anne is romantic in spirit. She and her friends read these types of books and a lot of the poems as well. So they often talk about the books and what happened, and there was a heroine who had to be rescued and she was in peril, and this is filled with terror, and let's imagine rather that the forest is haunted, and we can't go through there because the spirit of a dead baby is haunting the woods. All of these things, they're imagining both gothic scenes and horribly romantic, these women who are in peril and they're rescued, and they're in one story that Anne writes, someone faints and is carried 3 miles home by her love. So the book really is not romantic. Anne is romantic, but the narrator and the book is not. So what we are moving into now is called realism. Realism, we'll talk about what that means, but it was a different literary movement that came after Romanticism. And essentially, it's kind of, let me get my pen here. It's kind of like if you think of a clock, like the pendulum swings this way and then it swings the other way, right? And so romanticism is over here, strong emotions. That was swinging away from the logic of the Age of Reason, and now we're kind of swinging back. And what the realists attempted to do was depict more realistic scenes of everyday life. In particular, there's a movement within that called the regionalists, or regionalism. And those were writers in this period who tried to accurately represent their culture and people from all walks of life, not just the elite. Typically, in the region of the country, for the United States literature, Mark Twain wrote about what life was like on the Mississippi in Missouri as a young boy. Bret Harte is another author. He wrote about mining towns during the gold rush. A lot of his short stories are set during that time. Edith Wharton was part of New York Society and wrote about New York. So all of these authors were looking at a particular region. How did these people talk? How did they live? And everyday things. So while some of the scrapes that Anne gets into are a little bit far-fetched, I think we mentioned last time, right, dyeing her hair green and things like that, there are other things that are really not. Having a fight with a friend, leaving something off. I don't want to quite give it away. Having a mistake when you're doing cooking. I'll put it that way. There's a couple incidents where she tries to cook something and it doesn't go well. So those are little things. Walking through the woods and spraining your ankle, right? Those are the little things that are kind of everyday life. Now it's heightened a little bit because it's fiction, but it's still everyday life. Oh, so what I was going to say is, before I move on to the next, yes, the idea that this romantic literature that Anne and her friends love so much is a tiny bit silly, which kind of leads us to my next point, which is tone and point of view. The writing style and literary movement have an impact on the tone and the point of view. So the book has an omniscient third-person narrator. A lot of the books we've looked at are first person, where it's just from that person's perspective. And I love that this book isn't, because Anne does things that are ridiculous. And if it were told from her point of view, it wouldn't be quite as funny. And so the third person narrator kind of has a lot of humor in all of these little adventures. The book is told through episodes, so it's a little bit episodic, but it's linear, meaning it goes from beginning to end chronologically, and all of those episodes do tie together. So each little episode, there's a little bit of humor. Sometimes we see that in Marilla's lips twitching, trying not to smile. Sometimes we see it as Anne and her friends try to do some sort of imaginative play and it goes horribly wrong. So look for that. How is the author not really laughing at Anne? I would say, not the author, I'm sorry, the narrator. I don't think that the narrator is laughing at Anne or making fun of her. I think what the narrator is doing, and the point of view, is kind of like, this is childhood, and this is the kind of thing that all of us do as kids. We all struggle to fit in, and we all try our hardest to be very serious, and then it goes quite wrong. So there's a great contrast between the romantic ideas of the girls, the thrill of a novel of women being rescued by brave knights, versus the actual romance going on in their lives, which is there's a porch wall at the school, behind the school, and the boys sometimes will take notice and write their name next to a girl's, and sometimes the girls will do it as well. And Anne thinks that this would be humiliating. But for kids, this is romance, right? Like carving your name into a tree, or your initials rather. This is from the 1986 movie. I won't spoil it for you, but someone is over to dinner and Anne has accidentally wrecked the meal, and you can see her face of agony here, realizing what she's done, and Marilla also looking appalled, and the shocked look at their visitor's face. So in terms of tone, we have a very nostalgic tone, looking back at the past with fondness, but the tone is also amused and compassionate. It has great love for Anne and sympathy for her situation, but also these things are a little bit funny. Oh, okay, so this brings us to my last thing. I didn't necessarily want to go through all of the literary allusions in this book. There are many, but there's one in particular that I think is kind of confusing if you don't know what they're talking about. So, Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote a poem, The Lady of Shalott. The poem is based on Arthurian legend, so King Arthur and the Knights of Camelot. King Arthur was married to Queen Guinevere. Sir Lancelot was his most favored knight, and Guinevere and Lancelot had an affair, and it basically destroyed Camelot from the inside out. So they were very vulnerable once they were open to attack from outside forces. I don't want to get into that whole story, but at any rate, there's a woman named Elaine. She's also called the Lily Maid, and she was cursed. She lives in a tower, and she's weaving a scene every night and day, but all she has to look at is a mirror. So she's not allowed to look down directly on Camelot. She can only see the kingdom of Camelot reflected in her mirror. And people know that she's up in this tower and that she's cursed, but they don't know why she's being kept up there. So there she is. There she weaves by night and day a magic web of colors gay. So this is her mirror. She's looking into it, looking down on Camelot, and there is the scene that she's weaving. So it looks maybe even like she's weaving the pictures that she sees. The balls of yarn all over the floor. So she's weaving a tapestry, and upon seeing Sir Lancelot for the first time, she falls in love with him, and this love is so strong that she decides to leave her tower. And when she leaves her tower, the curse comes upon her. So there she is. She puts herself in a boat. You can see the tapestries, right, that she was weaving. She takes the tapestries. She goes in this boat. You can see how in agony she is. And she floats down the river from her tower down to Camelot. But because she's cursed, she dies just before reaching the palace. And laying there dead in her boat, Lancelot sees her corpse and says she has a lovely face. And that's how the poem ends. I don't mean to laugh at it. It's actually quite a beautiful poem. So at one point, Anne and her friends decide to reenact this, and if you don't know the context for it, it's quite confusing what they're trying to do. And then, of course, does it go the way that they anticipate, that it'll be this beautiful romantic scene with one of them in a boat floating down the river, and that the others will look out at that girl and say, oh, she has such a lovely face? No, it doesn't go well at all. Kind of like, that romantic ideal versus having your name carved in a tree with someone else's and feeling that embarrassment. Okay, so that's it for today. Next time, we're going to talk about themes and why one of these book covers is appropriate for the book and the other one is not. So that's it for today. I look forward to reading your comments about the book, and I will see you next time.